Cool. So as a class, we have two general questions that we all have to ask the authors that we're talking to. So we wanted to see if we could start off with those questions first, and then we each have a respective question. But we're also going to be very mindful of your time, just because I know it must be super busy and everything. So we'll see how much we get through, but I think we should just start with the two questions that Andrea posted for us. So as you know, that our class is called Slow Reading. And so there's a lot of different concepts to going into that. So with that in mind, the first question that we would like to ask you is, what is reading to you? And what are your favorite forms of reading?
I love that question. It's not at all the first question that I thought you would start with. I absolutely love reading. I have loved to read since I was probably like 5 or 6 years old. I have many different ways of reading different genres, especially. So like now I read ethnographies for work. And so I read them in this almost mechanical, methodical way where part of the purpose is to extract information from them and remember the information that I'm extracting. And I actually don't like reading in that way. I'm happy that it's my job to read that way, but it's not my favorite way of reading. My favorite way of reading is just reading fiction, reading where I don't have to remember anything. I don't have to purposely try to extract information from the text, and I'm just able to sort of read in this relaxing way. So like, reading on vacation, reading while I'm laying on the beach and just like, maybe drifting in and out of sleep while I'm reading. That's my absolute favorite form of reading. I also really enjoy rereading things. So it's something that I've been doing now that I teach more graduate classes. I reread theory texts each time I teach them. And it's a really cool experience to have read a complex text like 10, 11, 12 times and to get more and more out of it every single time. So those are the main forms of reading that I engage in.
Great. So let's move on to the second question. So the second one is, throughout our class, we have been discussing how to precipitate insights and or thoughts that one might not predict at the beginning of a research project. So what are your thoughts on ethnography as a way of thinking, and whether it allows us to approach the unexpected, or as Trio would say, remaining open to the unthinkable?
Yeah, in my own research process for working on food in Cuba, I definitely, I first went to the field wanting to work on what might seem like a similar topic, but actually is quite different, to look at community gardens and organic small farming outside of the city of Havana. And I did try to pursue that project, but I found that Cubans themselves, or the Cubans that I talked to, didn't find that to be interesting, and they didn't care. They didn't really want to talk to me about organic vegetables. Instead, they wanted to talk to me about how hard it was for them to find any food at all. And they really didn't care about finding organic vegetables, let alone finding vegetables, period. So I pivoted my project, both because it was too difficult for me to pursue the project I initially thought I wanted to pursue, and because it didn't make sense to me to pursue a research project that local people were not interested in talking about. So that's like a pretty explicit example of pivoting. But there's also like some things that I find in general that I think a lot of people have this issue where you have like ingrained ideas in your head about how things are supposed to be, and your field site opens you up to other ways of thinking about things. So for me, one of those things is nutrition science. I have a master's in public health, and prior to starting my PhD, took a lot of classes in nutrition, and I implemented a nutrition program in the Philippines. And so going into this work, I thought of myself as someone that knows a lot about nutrition. But in Cuba, they think of nutrition differently from how I was trained to think about it. And so it has taken, and it still takes a lot of time and effort for me to not think that my way of understanding nutrition is the correct way. So for instance, one example is like Cubans think of sugar as something that is really a very vital thing to consume. It's something that if you're an athlete or a dancer, you should eat a lot of sugar because it gives you like the vital energy that you need to perform. Or like kids that are not feeling well or maybe are kind of sickly should be given lots of sugar. And these are things that, you know, in the context of the United States, we are told the exact opposite. So just sort of honoring that is the truth in that context, and not trying to override it with the other ideas about sugar that I've been inundated with.
Great, thank you. Did Mariana, Mary Claire want to ask a question?
Sorry, I'm in a place. I was curious just about how you did come to your interest in community gardens before you realized what would be more relevant for the people you met there. But then my other question after that is about Trullo, because we read his book, Silencing the Past. Yeah, we read Silencing the Past very early on in this course. And so it like stuck out to me a lot when I saw his work influenced in your book. And so I was just wondering how, if he is like significant to your work, what has been most important from his scholarship in your work? Either one of those you want to take.
Yeah, okay. So the first question about organic gardening and organic farming, it just was like, when it's really simple, like when you Google food in Cuba or gardens in Cuba, you get all of these articles and literature that comes up about it. There was a period in the late 1990s, early 2000s when a lot of people were writing about it. And many of those people were affiliated with one particular food-related organization. And they're also affiliated with 2 or 3 people in Cuba. And so I was reading this literature and thinking, because there was such an abundance of it, and because it was coming up first in my searches, I thought that it had a broader relevance than it did. And I think that the way that they published on this phenomenon does make it seem like it's more broad than it is. But, you know, so basically, once I got there and I realized what was happening, that was when I pieced together that, oh, this is actually just a handful of people that are publishing on this. And then people are like, people from the media or students or other people are going and visiting these different gardens, and then they're writing like a blog post, or they're writing different things about it, and it's sort of generating a lot on various internet algorithms, but it's not actually a significant phenomenon within Cuba. And for Trujillo's work, I think Trujillo has been really influential for me in general, but the thing that sticks out to me the most are his arguments about the savage slot. which I'm not sure you touched. It looks like you have touched on that in your class. So just thinking about how historically anthropologists have looked at others as savages, as barbarians, as different in a way that is either negative or in a way that is sort of like magical and glorifying. And I think I actually read his work at first when I was an undergrad at Rice. And that really stuck into my head as like, that is not the way to do anthropology, even though so much of what you read in like the canon is doing that. So I think his work was very influential in making me sort of not replicate the kinds of anthropology that make people into either savages or, like I said, magical people or people who are suffering and deserve pity. So yeah, so that's basically his major influence on my thinking.
Thank you.
I guess kind of bouncing off of that, because I think that's kind of where this politics of adequacy comes in. I wanted to ask, because like I just found that whole framework fascinating in such a different way to think about kind of like poverty or like justice or just like systems of like power in general. I wanted to ask you if you like how you identify like politics of adequacy or just like the concept of adequacy in context outside of Cuba. Like for instance, because like, for example, the United States is in such a like state of ongoing like civil and political and racial crisis right now. Like if you see like adequacy kind of like manifesting in any ways that are parallel to those who identified in Cuba.
Yes, absolutely. It's a concept that I definitely came to through doing my research in Cuba, but I think it has broad applications, and I certainly see it applying to the research that I'm currently doing in Los Angeles. So right now I'm doing research on food justice organizations that are trying to increase access to healthy food in South LA and East LA, which are predominantly Black and Latinx. And the understanding that people have of what an adequate food system is something that I see as like very broad and varied. Basically, people have wildly different concepts of what an idealized food system would be when they're the people who don't live in the area, right? So when I'm talking about food justice organizations that are trying to change food somewhere else from where they live versus the people who actually live there tend to have very different ideas from the outside people about what an adequate food system would be. But it's also something we've seen with the ways that there have been shortages in food in the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't know how it's been in Texas, but here in California, there have been all kinds of shortages. There are still ongoing shortages and limits. For instance, you can only buy 1 pack of chicken at the grocery store each week. You can get around that by buying like a super pack that has a ton of chicken in it, but you're only allowed to buy 1 thing of chicken a week. Well, they say it's a week, but they can't really control if you go into the store multiple times. But anyway, thinking about, so that makes me think about what an adequate food distribution system looks like, you know, in times of crisis, in a pandemic. I think we can also think about adequacy in terms of water or housing. So like water, for instance, if you think about Flint, Michigan, they have a water system, but is it an adequate water system? Who determines if it's an adequate water system? Is it the people who are actually drinking and using the water and washing their hands and bathing in it? Or is it outside people or politicians that are making these decisions? And similar with housing, whether you're thinking about homelessness or whether you're thinking about just inadequate housing that's doesn't provide living conditions for thriving. So yeah, those are some of the ways that I think about it applying in other areas.
Great. I had a quick question since we're talking about the politics of adequacy, but it's more as a researcher. So I wanted to see it when I was reading your book, particularly in the breakdown chapter, when you're talking about the emotional dimensions of politics of adequacy and distress and how people feel when they're seeking food. So my question to you was, how do you as a researcher in these spaces that are with vulnerable people, vulnerable situations, do you practice self-care? And in certain dimensions, like when you're there in the book, you mentioned that you were there at 5:45 in the morning sometimes, or you're there with them for 10 hours a day while they're doing very difficult labor. So I wanted to see how you might gauge self-care in those situations and how I might differentiate between outside field work.
Yeah. Yeah, my field methods were not very healthy. I was not, and so I chose to do this intensive field work, this very immersive field work, because I wanted to like forget that I was away from my wife, basically. So I knew from going there for shorter periods of time, like over the summers and winter breaks, that if I was idle, that I would miss her and want to go home. And, it was challenging for my mental health to be idle. So I intentionally developed this super intense methodology so that I would not miss being with my partner. In some ways it worked. Like I didn't have time to miss anyone because I was so busy with all these families, and but it also just sort of spun out of control towards the end, because one of the factors that I didn't really account for was that with each family, I couldn't just stop being friends with them or communicating with them. Like I was invited to birthday parties and weddings, and they just wanted me to come over. And so I, by the end, I had these 22 families that were all like constantly inviting me to stuff, and I was trying to figure out how to possibly balance my time. And it resulted in a combination of me like spending a little bit less time with the families later in the study, and then sort of fracturing some relationships with the earlier families where I just disappointed them by not being able to show up to all the stuff that they wanted me to show up to. So yeah, there was no self-care involved in my research methods. And when I was there was another researcher that did make a comment to me that I was going to burn out if I kept on like that. But my response to her was like, well, this is a finite amount of time. I don't have to do this for till I'm done. And so it was, in the end, I was fine. I didn't burn out. I would not repeat these methods though now as who I am. Now I still do field work, and I do it much slower, and I balance it with other things. Now I usually bring a child with me to the field. And so that makes you slow because you have to take care of children.
Oh, thank you. That's interesting.
I guess kind of a follow-up question to that. How do your interactions with your interlocutors like shift now that if you do field work with a kid in tow?
They shifted radically. So a lot of my interactions are just people sort of obsessing over my kids. So people didn't really pay attention to me to begin with. I was very much like a quiet observer in a lot of cases, but now they really don't pay any attention to me, and they're paying a lot of attention to my child or children. My children don't speak Spanish, so they don't actually have a reciprocal communication process with anyone. But so that part has changed, but then also just like the amount of time that I can spend doing something has changed, because my kids will, like, I would say that if we're eating a meal and if they're able to watch TV, my kids will last like 3 or 4 hours in someone's house. And that's like pushing it. So the time frame of conducting research has changed significantly.
So we hit our half an hour, which is what we were trying to kind of gauge out of respect for your time. So how are we doing with time with you? Do you have a few more minutes for one more question?
Yeah, I can answer 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay. Mariana or Mary Claire, you want to ask?
I was curious about, well, now I'm more curious about your kid, and well, you said you were in people's houses. So like, does your current research with food nonprofits often take place in places like houses in people's private spaces? And can you just describe the places you end up going and being around people?
Okay, I should clarify. So I continue to travel to Cuba and have been developing 2 different research projects in Cuba. So when I was talking about bringing my kids to Cuba, that's what I was talking about. And I've been developing one project on rising rates of obesity there, and people who want to lose weight, and sort of how what methods they employ to lose weight, and what they draw upon, whether it's part of the medical or public health system or other things that they draw upon. So I've been sort of conducting that, but recently with rising rates of scarcity in Cuba, the rates of obesity have gone down, and it's actually kind of a sensitive topic because people are trying to gain weight. So I've kind of not talked about that as much with people. I'm also was developing a project on the rise in restaurants and Cubans going to restaurants. So there had been a lot of restaurants in Cuba, but mostly they were catering to foreigners. And there's sort of an increase in restaurant culture among Cuban households. But that's another thing that has sort of tapered off with the economic difficulties that they're having. So those are the things I've been doing in Cuba. In my research in Los Angeles, I work with organizations, and so there's some settings in which I couldn't bring a child. Like, for instance, I might go to a board meeting, and I wouldn't bring a child to a board meeting. But they also have all kinds of events. Like every year, the city has an annual food day, or various organizations have volunteer days every Saturday, or they'll have, I don't know, they'll get a grant and then they'll have like a celebration for getting a grant. So I bring my kids with me to those events, especially because they're usually on weekends, because they want regular working people to be able to attend their events. So yeah, bringing kids to those events is usually because it's like a festival or a celebration or something, the kids are usually have a little bit longer attention span.
Okay, well, that will be the end of the recording interview portion of the interview. So thank you so much for your time and your responses and feedback.